and welcome to Shabir Ally Apologetica podcast. I'm Edrei, and my intention here is to defend the Christian faith from Brazil. Today, we have the honor to receive here Dr. Angel Luke from Hong Kong. Welcome, Dr. Luke. It is a pleasure to have you here.
Hi, EJ. Good to see you. Good morning. And hello, everyone in Brazil. It's great to be here to be speaking to you all today.
So, let me know about yourself. Tell me more about you and your work.
I'm currently an associate professor at Hong Kong Baptist University, where I teach philosophy of religion, science and religion, and Christian theology. My areas of research includes the Kalam cosmological argument, the historical evidence for the resurrection of Jesus, the deity of Christ, and the incarnation.
Thank you for this presentation. And let me start by asking you in fact, about Kalam cosmological argument. How do you prefer to formulate the Kalam cosmological argument so that it read for is a good part of the current objections, and what are the strong points of this argument?
Okay, so let me share my screen with you all. So the contents of my presentation this morning is taken from my book called The Teleological and Kalam Cosmological Arguments Revisited. Now, this book is open access and is available for free download online. So you can go to my website and you can download this book for free. So I formulated the Kalam argument this way. Premise one, there exists a series of causes and effects and changes. Right, so we observe that things change, and we observe that some things come from other things. Right, so for example, I came from my parents came from my grandparents, etc. Now, this series of causes and effect either has an infinite regress that avoids the first cause, or its members are joined together like a closed loop that avoids the first cause, or it has a first cause. Right, so either the series is infinite or is finite. Right, if it's finite, then there's a first, there's a last, either they are joined together or they are not joined together. If they are not joined together, then there must be a first cause. And I go on to show that this series is not an infinite regress and is not a closed loop, and therefore there is a first cause. Now I will talk about the reasons why it's not an infinite regress and why it's not a closed loop later on, right? But at this moment, I'm just outlining the arguments for you all to follow. So very briefly, right, there are at least 5 arguments against an infinite regress. So the first one will be the argument from the impossibility of concrete actual infinities. So this will be the familiar Hilbert Hotel argument, which William Lane Craig has used. And another argument is the argument from the impossibility of transversing an actual infinite. So what the argument is basically trying to say is that finite plus finite equals finite, right? So one after another is always, it will constitute only a finite series. It cannot constitute an infinite series. And therefore the series of past events must be finite as well, since it is constituted by a one after another process. Now, the third argument is the argument from the viciousness of dependence regress. I will talk about this briefly later on. And there's also the argument from the Grim Reaper paradox and the argument from the second law of thermodynamics, which indicates that entropy is always increasing. And since the world now is not totally disordered, this shows that the past must be finite, right? Because if the past were infinite, entropy would have increased to infinity by now, and the world would have been totally disordered, but the world is not totally disordered now, and therefore this indicates that the history of the world has a beginning, it's not infinite. And you can check out this article published by, written by Aaron Wall at Cambridge University. It's also available for download online. This paper explains the argument from the generalized second law of thermodynamics, right, which indicates that time has a beginning as well. Now, the argument from vision source of dependence regress is quite easy to understand. So we can imagine there's a series of train cars, and these train cars, they were not moving originally, right? So before the last train car began to move, the one before it has to begin to move first. But before the one begin to move, the one before it has to begin to move first. Now, if that is all there is, then nothing will begin to move, right? Because everyone is dependent on the one before it. So this shows that a dependence regress is a vicious regress, and a causal regress is a dependence regress. Therefore, a causal regress is a vicious regress. So what is required is that there must be a first puller, right, of an engine, which has the capacity to begin movement by itself. And such a thing must exist, right, in order for the rest of the train cars, that in order that the train cars can begin to move, right? Otherwise, they will never begin to move. So likewise, before I begin to exist, my parents have to begin to exist first. But before they begin to exist, their parents have to begin to exist first. Now, no matter how many prior dependent causes there are, none of them will begin to exist, because no prior dependent cause escapes from the problem of depending on the prior dependent member in order to begin to exist, right? So it's like it'll be like a series of train cars, right? None of them can just begin to move. So what is required is a first cause, right? There must be a first cause, which can exist independently and necessarily. Such a first cause must exist, right, in order for other things to exist. So this is a very simple argument to show that there must be a first cause. And this argument also shows that the causal loop, it cannot be a causal loop, that cannot be a causal loop that avoids a first cause. Why? Because a causal loop will be something like train car A depends on train car B, and train car B depends on train car C, and train car C depends on train car A, right? You'll be like saying that I came from my parents came from my grandparents, and my grandparents came from me, right? So obviously, such a loop cannot work. There cannot be such a loop that avoids a first cause, and therefore there must be a first cause. And then the Kalam argument goes on to explain what is the first cause. Well, since the first cause is the first, it must be uncaused, and it must be able to exist independently, right? And since whatever begins to exist has a cause, the first cause must be without beginning. It must be something that always existed, right? And therefore does not require a cause. Now, since every change is an event which has a beginning as something or part of a thing gains or loses a property, the first cause must be initially changeless, right? Because a change is something that has a beginning. However, the first cause has no beginning, so it must be initially changeless. Now, since the first cause is initially changeless, it is transcendent and immaterial. Why? Because material things constantly change, according to the laws of quantum physics. However, the first cause is initially changeless. So this means that the first cause is not a quantum system, which is constantly changing. It is not something material. It is something that is beyond material, is transcendent, right, in that sense. Now, moreover, in order to cause an event, whether it's in the Big Bang or whatever, from the initial changeless state, the first cause must have the capacity to originate the first event in a way that is not determined by prior events, since the first cause is the first. So the first cause must be able to initiate the first event, the first change by itself, and also have the capacity to prevent itself from changing, for otherwise, it would not have been initially changeless initially, right? So it must be able to hold back from causing the first change and also be able to bring about the first change. Now, these two capacity imply that the first cause has libertarian freedom, right? Having these two capacity means that the first cause is free. It can freely bring about the first event and also refrain from causing the first event. And so this shows that the first cause is something that has freedom. And this also implies that it is not something that is physical, right, that follows physical laws, but it's something that is free, that can, and it implies that it's something like a person, right, who can freely choose to do something or not to do something. Okay, so the first cause is a person, is a personal creator. Moreover, we have good reasons to think that the first cause is an intelligent person. And at this point in time, we can also combine the Kalam argument with the teleological arguments. So the teleological argument basically indicates that the universe have evidence of design. For example, scientists have discovered that the evidence that the universe is fine-tuned for the existence of life. And moreover, there's a high degree of order in the universe, which scientists can formulate in terms of the laws of nature, right? So the laws of nature indicate that that the universe is right. There's mathematical equation. Law, this order and the fine-tuning indicates that the first cause must be highly intelligent in order to bring about a physical world that is. So we have good reasons to believe that the first cause is highly intelligent, and in order to bring about the entire universe with its billions of stars and galaxies, right, with the laws of nature and the amazing fine-tuning. And therefore, we can conclude that there must be a first cause that is uncaused, beginningless, initially changeless, transcendent, immaterial, has libertarian freedom, and is also highly intelligent and powerful. So such a first cause, right, means that it is a creator of the universe. And therefore, the universe must have come from a personal creator. And so this is the Kalam cosmological argument, which proves that the universe is created by a creator God. Now, I want to emphasize that the cosmological argument is a deductively valid argument. And moreover, the premises are true, as I already explained. Now, the conclusion of a sound argument must be true, right? So a sound argument means an argument which is deductively valid and the premises are true. Since the premises are true and the deduction is valid, the conclusion is true. And therefore, we can know that it is true that there is a creator of the universe. So I shall pause here and let you ask other questions.
I really appreciate how you demonstrate the Kalam argument, because even if the argument is very well known, some people have trouble with defining those terms. And then it's very, how can I say? It's very carefully explained. And I want to make a quick question. What do you think about the objection for the cosmological argument, the Kalam argument, that used quantum physics and says that Big Bang is not really the beginning of everything? Does this really compromise the argument of the beginning of space and time? Therefore, this argument compromised the Kalam cosmological argument.
All right, thank you for your question. Now, my response is that, first of all, my argument does not actually depend on the Big Bang, right? So you will notice that the way I formulate the argument actually avoids the objection, because I did not actually use the Big Bang as a premise for my argument, right? Rather, my argument starts from the fact that there exists a series of my argument starts from the fact that there exists a series of causes and effect. So whether there is Big Bang or no Big Bang, right? There still exists this series, and this series still cannot be an infinite regress, and it still must have a first cause, right? So regardless of whether there's Big Bang or not, there must still be a first cause. And the first cause, as I said earlier on, right, it must be uncaused, without beginning, and initially changeless, and also has free will, right, to bring about the first event, whether the first event is the Big Bang or not, right? There must be a first cause that has the freedom to bring about the first event. So my first point in response is that my argument does not actually require the Big Bang. Now, the second, so even if the Big Bang is not the beginning of everything, so even if there's something before the Big Bang, we still can ask, where did that come from, right? And as I said earlier on, there cannot be infinite regress. So ultimately there must still be a first cause, right? So even if the Big Bang is not the ultimate beginning, even if the Big Bang comes from something else, that something else must ultimately come from a first cause. So the conclusion that the first cause exists, right, cannot be avoided. And my argument goes on to show that the first cause must be a personal creator, right? So that is the first point. And therefore, even if the Big Bang is not the beginning of everything, that does not avoid the conclusion of my argument that a creator exists. Now, the second point I want to raise is that, well, if the Big Bang comes from a quantum realm, right? So, because nowadays there are some scientists who use quantum physics and say that the Big Bang could have came from a quantum state, right? A quantum realm. But as I said earlier on, we can ask, where did that quantum state come from, right? Where did that quantum realm come from? And as I said earlier on, right, there cannot be infinite regress. So that quantum realm must still have come from a first cause, which is a creator. So again, right, it doesn't compromise the conclusion that there is a first cause who created everything. Now, the third point is that none of the quantum physical models, by the way, are confirmed, right? So the scientists are still trying to figure out various quantum physical models. None of them are confirmed. And the reason is because we currently do not have a well-established theory of quantum gravity. So in any case, those quantum physical models, they are not confirmed anyway, right? And anyway, they don't avoid a first cause. They don't avoid a creator, as I already explained just now. And finally, we need to note that these quantum physical models, they are supposed to be scientific models, right? And science itself requires deductive and also inductive reasoning, right? Science requires deduction as well as induction. And I already explained just now, deduction, if an argument is deductively valid and the premises are true, then the conclusion must be true, right? The conclusion of a sound argument must be true. And therefore, and I already explained just now that the Kalam cosmological argument is deductively valid, right? And so, and also I already explained that the premises are true, right? So the conclusion cannot be avoided anyway, right? Because science itself also depends on deduction, right? So, and I already used a deductive argument to show that there must be a first cause, right, which is a creator. And so in any case, no, science can never refute the Kalam cosmological argument.
Thank you for your amazing case for cosmological and teleological arguments. But you have also a good work on Christology. And let me ask you about worship of Jesus as a God. Today we have a certain groups of people who do not admit that Jesus is God fully, such as Jehovah's Witness, very common here in Brazil. But all Christians think Jesus has the divine nature. Now, if you asked a first century Christian what he thought about Jesus, would he answer that Jesus is God?
Yes, and on this point, it is very important to note the creator-creature divide, which is affirmed by the earliest Christians, right? So first, because we need to understand that the leaders among the first century Christian leaders, right? So people like the 12 apostles, the Apostle Paul, right? These were the leaders of the earliest Christian movement. And these leaders, they were all Jews. And for the Jews, they hold to this view that God is the creator of all things, and there's a distinction between the creator and the creature, and that human beings should only worship the creator rather than the creature, right? So this is a very important point, a very important assumption that is held by the earliest Christian leaders. And the second point we need to note is that the earliest Christians, the earliest Christian leaders, they regard Jesus not as a creature, but they regard Jesus to be on the creator side of the creator-creature divide, right? So I mentioned earlier on that the earliest Christians, they distinguish between the creator and the creature, and they regard Jesus. So where did they place Jesus? So is Jesus a creature or is Jesus a creator? Now the earliest Christian leaders, they regard Jesus to be on the creator side, right? They think of Jesus as the creator, but not as the creature. And we can see this in various texts that is found in the New Testament, right? Written in the 1st century. So, for example, in 1 Corinthians chapter 8, verse 6. So this is a letter written by Paul, and it's written during the mid-1st century, and it reflects the beliefs of the earliest Christians. In 1 Corinthians chapter 8, verse 6, it says that all things came from the Father, and all things came through Jesus, right? Through whom are all things. So this implies that both the Father and Jesus are within the one being of God, from which and through which all things come, right? Now, when we read this text, and when we read Romans chapter 11, verse 36, for example, we'll find that when we combine these two texts together, we find that it clearly implies that Jesus is within the being of God. Why? Because Romans chapter 11, 36 says, from him and through him and to him are all things, right? From him is from God, through him is through God, and to him, to God are all things, right? So all things came from God and through God. And in 1 Corinthians 8:6, it says all things came from the Father and through Jesus, right? So this implies that Jesus is God, right? So this implies that both the Father and Jesus are within the one being of God. So this implies that the earliest Christians regard Jesus to be within the one being of God.
If we look back at the history, there's some people that claims that figures that has claimed themselves to be the Messiah were common on back then. How can we see the claims of that Jesus had made differently from the other ones?
Now, earlier on, I explained that the earliest Christians regarded Jesus to be on the creator, right, side of the creator-creature divide. So the question is, why did the earliest Christians regard Jesus to be the creator, right? Now, this is something utterly astonishing. It's something very unique. Because when we look at the other messianic movements, which we mentioned, we find that the other figures, they were not regarded to be the creator of all things, right? So those figures, they are only regarded as some kind of human figures, right? They are just human beings who, according to their followers, these human beings are supposed to be anointed by God, right? God used them to save the Jews, right? So there will be some people like similar to in the Old Testament, right? God used Moses, God used Joshua, right, to save the Israelites. But Moses was not the creator of all things, right? Joshua was not the creator of all things. The Jews never regard Moses, Joshua to be the creator of all things. However, the earliest Christian leaders who were Jews, they regard Jesus to be the creator of all things, right? All things came through him. So this shows that Jesus, right, is very different, right, from these other messianic figures. So why would the earliest Christians regard Jesus to be the creator? Now, in my book, The Origin of Divine Christology, I argue that the only plausible explanation, the only reasonable explanation is that Jesus must have made some claims about himself, right? Jesus must have claimed to be God and also demonstrate himself to be God by resurrecting from the dead. And that is the reason why the earliest Christians who were devout Jews, that is how they would regard Jesus, right, to be God. because otherwise it will be idolatry, right? For them to worship a human being as God, right? So the earliest Christians, they were not idolaters. They were not idolaters, right? They only worship one God. But the interesting thing is that they also worship Jesus, right? They also regard Jesus to be within the one being of God. And historically, the best explanation is that Jesus must have claimed to be God and prove himself to be God by resurrecting from the dead. So this is what makes Jesus different from the other messianic figures, which you mentioned earlier on.
Well, so the divinity of Jesus leaves us with another question, the incarnation. And you have a good work on the theme of incarnation. In fact, Christians believe that Jesus is 100% man and 100% God. What better way to show that one person can have both human and divine nature?
Well, this is a very good question. Now, in my book, The Cryptic Model of the Incarnation, I provided a model, right, to show that Jesus is truly divine and truly human, right? Now, by the way, just now when you use the word 100%, this phrase can be misleading, right? It can cause people to think that, well, all parts of Jesus is God and all parts of him is human. No, actually, that is not how the incarnation should be understood. Rather, what the incarnation means is that Jesus is truly divine and also truly human, right? He has a divine nature that is 100% divine and also a human nature that is 100% human. It doesn't mean that the whole of Jesus is divine and the whole of Jesus is human. No, what it means is that Jesus has a divine nature that is 100% divine and a human nature which is 100% human. Now, how can that be the case? To answer that question, we can think of Jesus existing without a physical body initially, right? So I mentioned just now, Jesus is the creator of all things. All things came through Jesus, right? He was the creator. He claimed to be the creator and proved himself to be the creator by resurrecting from the dead. So we have good reasons to believe that Jesus is God, right? So he existed before all things. He is the creator of all things. So even when there was no universe, even when there's no physical bodies, right, he already exists as the spirit, right? Because God is a spirit. So Jesus exists in a spiritual form, in a divine, and he's truly divine. He's God initially, and after God created the universe, and later on, God also created human beings, and then later on, Jesus took up a human nature at the incarnation. So at the incarnation, through the Holy Spirit, Mary conceived, right? And so we can think of the Holy Spirit miraculously creating the first cell of Jesus, the body of Jesus in the womb of Mary. And this body is assumed, is taken up by the pre-existing Jesus, right? So Jesus assumed this, took this as his body. And as Jesus took up this body, Jesus also limited himself, right? He restricted his consciousness. He restricted his, the use of his divine nature, right? So that he can limit himself and take up a human consciousness, a human body, and that is how he can be incarnated. So on this view, Jesus, in accordance with his human nature, he has a body that is limited in space and time, right? So the body is in Mary's womb, right? So with respect to his human nature, Jesus is bounded in space-time. However, in respect of his divine nature, he remains unbounded. Why? Because when he restricts himself, he still has a divine pre-conscious right, that remains unrestricted. So just now when I mentioned that Jesus restricted himself, I was referring to his consciousness, right? I was referring to him limiting the scope of his consciousness. However, his mind can include a pre-conscious, which remains unlimited. So the basic idea is that restrict himself. He can choose to use some of his powers and also choose not to use some of his powers, right? So, suppose, for example, right, if I have some superpower, right, if I'm Superman, for example, right, I can use my powers, right, to fly, but I can also choose not to fly, right? I can choose to remain on Earth. I can choose not to fly if I want, right? So likewise, God is all powerful, but God can also choose to use or not to use his powers, right? So at the incarnation, Jesus chose not to use his superpowers. In some cases, in many cases, right? He chose to restrict himself. He chose not to be conscious of all things, and that is how his consciousness can be limited and take up a human nature. But on the other hand, his powers are still there, right? It's just like when Superman chooses not to fly, he can still fly, right? His power to fly is still there, even when he's not using it. So likewise, Jesus, right? His divine powers are still there, even when he's not using it. And his divine powers are within his pre-conscious, are within his divine mind, right? And that is how he can still be omnipotent and omniscient and omnipresent, because the powers are still there, right, in his divine nature. So he is still truly divine. And on the other hand, he is also truly human. Why? Because he has taken up a human body. And that human body has all the property, and also that human body has the properties of being human. And also his consciousness was limited, right? And that is how he can have a fully human experience. Right, he can experience the limitation of a human life, and his consciousness can also experience the pain of the human body, which he has, and that is how he can suffer for us and also die on the cross for our sins. So on this model, we can see how is it the case that Jesus can be truly divine and also truly human at the same time.
Can you make please just a quick presentation about how Christians today and apologetics deal with the resurrection?
All right, thank you for your question. Now, this is a very important question because the resurrection, right, is the most important piece of evidence which shows that Jesus is truly divine, right? As I mentioned earlier on. So how do we know that Jesus truly rose from the dead? Now, to summarize the evidence, we can put it this way. First of all, we can talk about the historical evidence. And the historical evidence is such that despite disagreements about various aspects of the New Testament, there is actually a widespread agreement among historians that Jesus was a real historical figure. No, he was not a legendary figure, but he was a real historical person who lived in the 1st century and who died due to Roman crucifixion. And secondly, very soon after he died, a number of people had experiences that they believe were appearances of the risen Jesus, right? So a number of people claim to have seen him alive after he died on the cross. And thirdly, the body of Jesus was missing, right? The physical body is no longer there. So many historians agree on these 3 facts. So the key question is, how do we explain these 3 facts? Now, in my book, Investigating the Resurrection of Jesus Christ, and also this article, The Resurrection of the Son of God, a reduction of naturalistic alternatives. Now, this article is published by Oxford University Press. Now, and by the way, this article and the book, they can be downloaded from my website online, right? So you can download it and read it for yourself. Now, in this book and article, I demonstrated that there are only a few possible explanations for those three facts, which I mentioned earlier on. So either there were no group of people who claimed that they saw the resurrected Jesus. So either there were no such group of people, or there were such group of people. Now, if there were a group of people who actually claim to have seen the risen Jesus, as most historians agree, so either they didn't see anything, right, or they did see something, right? So no, maybe they didn't see, maybe they didn't see anything. Maybe they just make up the story, right? Or they did see something, right? Now, almost all historians today reject this hypothesis that they didn't see anything. Why? Because from the historical evidence, we know that the first century Christians, they were willing to die for their faith, right? They were sincere in preaching the resurrection. They sincerely believed that Jesus resurrected. And they believe because they did experience something, right? Because if they didn't experience anything, but they claimed that they saw, then this would imply that they make up the story of the resurrection, right? The resurrection was made up by them. However, we know that no groups of people will be willing to die for what they know is a lie, right? A lot of people will be willing to die for what they believe is true, even though it may not be true. But no groups of people will be willing to die for something that they made up, right? For something that they know is false, right? Because if they make up the story, then they will know it's false. And if they know it's false, then they wouldn't have been willing to sacrifice everything for it. So, most historians, but the historical evidence indicates that the earliest Christians were willing to sacrifice for their faith. So this implies that no, this is not something that they make up, right? They must have seen something which convinced them that Jesus was alive. And that was the reason why they are willing to go out into the world to preach that Jesus was resurrected and were willing to die for their faith. So they must have seen something that convinced them that Jesus was alive. So what is it that they saw? There are only two possibilities. Either what they experience is something inside their mind, or it is caused by something outside their mind, right? So either it was something like a hallucination, something inside their mind, or there is someone outside their mind, there's something out there, which a real person that they saw, right? Now, the hallucination hypothesis is implausible because it's not only one or two people, but there were multiple groups of people who actually saw something. So it cannot be something that's just inside their individual minds, right? There must be something out there that people see together, right? So there must be a real person whom they saw. Now, if there's a real person they saw, then there are only two possibilities, right? Either that person was not Jesus, right? Maybe they mistook another person for Jesus, or it was Jesus, right? So either it was not Jesus or it was Jesus. Now, again, most historians have rejected the hypothesis that it was not Jesus because it is implausible. It is unreasonable to think that groups of people could have mistook another person for Jesus, given that Jesus was somebody who was a public figure and who was familiar to the disciples, right? We must know that we need to know that the disciples have spent a few years with Jesus, right, living together with him, and therefore they were very familiar with him, right? They know how he talked, they know how he behaved, and so it will be unreasonable to think that these disciples could have mistaken another person for Jesus, right? That simply does not work. Rather, they must have identified. Rather, the disciples must have identified carefully to make sure that it was Jesus before they would believe that he resurrected and that they will be willing to die for him, right? So and therefore the person must have been Jesus himself. Now, given that this person is Jesus himself, then there are only two possibilities. So either Jesus didn't die on the cross earlier, or he did die earlier. So in the past, some skeptics have speculated that, well, okay, it was Jesus, but maybe he didn't die on the cross earlier. Maybe he just fainted on the cross, and then he was buried. And then 3 days later, he woke up, escaped from the tomb, and told people he was alive. Right. Another possibility is that, well, maybe he escaped. Right. Maybe he wasn't crucified at all. Maybe the Roman soldiers crucified the wrong guy, and Jesus escaped. And then 3 days later, he came out again and he said, "Hey guys, I'm alive." Right. So that's how people believe he was alive. Right, so either Jesus was not crucified, or he was crucified but he didn't die, right? So there are these two possibilities. However, again, these two possibilities have been widely rejected by historians, because they are not plausible, they are unreasonable, right? It will be ridiculous to think that the Roman soldiers, the Jewish the Jewish high priest, all the enemies of Jesus, all of them mistook another person and crucified the wrong guy, right? That doesn't work. The enemies of Jesus must have made sure that this is the guy we want to kill, right? They must have made sure that it was him, right, before they crucified him, right? Otherwise, what's the point of crucifying another guy, right? So they must have made sure that it was him and crucified him, right? So, it is also unreasonable to think that Jesus could have survived the crucifixion, right? That he just fainted on the cross. Why? Because we need to understand that the crucifixion was the most severe form of punishment in the ancient Roman world, right? So the Romans, the ancient Romans, they were brutal. They were experts at killing people. And the crucifixion is the most pitiful form of death, right, for the criminal in the ancient world. So the Romans will make sure the guy die, right? They will use all kinds of ways to make sure the guy die. So for example, before they crucify a person, they will flog the person with a whip. And the whip that the Romans use has metal spikes attached to the whip, such that when they whip a person and they pull out the whip, the flesh, the blood vessels, and sometimes even the intestines will be pulled out, right? And so it was very brutal, and the victim will suffer from severe blood loss, such that sometimes people die even before they are crucified, right? They die because of blood loss, right? So Jesus was whipped, and they also put a crown of thorns on his scalp, and this crown of thorns will pierce the scalp, such that when they beat the crown, the thorns pierce into the scalp, and this can cause severe blood loss. And people who suffer from scalp lacerations, they can die within hours because of blood loss, because there's a lot of blood vessels in the scalp, right? So people can die within hours if they bleed from the head, right? They bleed from the scalp. And so the Romans used these different kinds of ways, right, to make sure the guy died on the cross. And they will also, sometimes they will also use the spear to pierce the person on the cross, right, to make sure the person died. So there's no way that Jesus could have survived the crucifixion, given that the Romans would have made sure that he died on the cross before they took him down. Now, the second point is that even if Jesus survived, right, so even if Jesus somehow survived the crucifixion, he would have been severely injured, right? He would have been bleeding, right, from his scalp, from his body, suffering from wounds all over the place of his body. And if Jesus was severely injured, how could he still have managed to escape, right, from the tomb, right? How could that would have been implausible. And even if he can still escape, right, even he can still climb up from the tomb and escape from the guards, the soldiers, when he appeared to the disciples, like, the disciples wouldn't have believed that he resurrected. When the disciples saw Jesus in that kind of state, still bleeding out of the place, and say, "Hey guys, I'm alive," the disciples would say that, "Well, no, he's barely alive. We need to save him. We need to give him blood transfusion. We need to save him," right? They wouldn't have regarded him as, the Lord, Savior of all, God of all creation. They wouldn't say, "Oh, hallelujah, no, God, Jesus resurrected." Rather, they will say, "Oh, no, our teacher is dying, right? We need to save him, right? Otherwise, he will die." So, so this hypothesis doesn't explain how the earliest Christians could have regarded Jesus to be the creator of all things, right? How they could have regarded Jesus as the Lord and truly resurrected. And therefore, this is a useless hypothesis. And that's why almost all historians today reject the soon hypothesis, right? So, so in conclusion, right, there is no other good alternative explanation to explain away the resurrection. And therefore, we can conclude that the historical evidence shows that in the first century, there were groups of people who actually claimed to have seen Jesus alive after he was crucified. And these people did see something, right? And what they saw is not a hallucination, but a real person, right, outside their mind. And this person was the same Jesus who died on the cross earlier and was seen alive again later. And so this proves that Jesus resurrected. Right? He was dead and he was alive. So it was the resurrected Jesus whom they saw. And so this proves that Jesus truly resurrected from the dead.
Wonderful. Thank you for your answers.
Thank you for your thank you again for your amazing case for the resurrection of Jesus. Well, the idea that the disciples let me reformulate this question. Debating with an atheist here in Brazil about the resurrection, I realized that although he admitted to historical facts like this, he denied the resurrection because he did not believe in miracles or supernatural events. What is the relationship between the resurrection and the possibility of miracles?
Yeah, so now this objection is a very common one. A lot of people today, they think that miracles are not possible because miracles are supposed to violate the laws of nature. And in fact, this is also an objection that was raised by Stephen Hawking, right? A famous scientist. He claimed that the laws of nature should hold everywhere at all times, otherwise they will be laws. And so he thinks that there could not be any exception or any miracle. However, this objection is based on a misunderstanding. Why? Because a miracle does not have to be understood as a violation of laws of nature. Rather, it can be understood as an event which will not have been produced by the natural causes operative at a certain time or place. So, therefore, unless we assume that causes other than natural causes do not exist, now this will be a circular argument and begs the question against a supernatural agent, such as a creator. Otherwise, miracles are possible. Now, to explain what I mean, right, we can think of this way. So, for example, I'm holding a cup in front of me, right? This is a cup. Now, if I let go of it, it will drop, right? If I let go of it, it will drop. Why? Because of the law of nature, the law of gravity. So it will drop. Now, suppose when I hold on to the cup, right? When I hold on to the cup, am I actually violating the laws of nature? Well, not really, because the law is still there, right? The law of the gravity is still there. So the reason why the cup does not drop is because there is something holding on to it, right? There is an intervention that prevents it from dropping. But this is not a violation of the law of nature because the law of nature is still there. Now, suppose God holds on to the cup, right? Now, if God hold the cup, then it will be a miracle, right? But would it be a violation of the laws of nature? Well, no, because the gravity is still there, right? It's just like when I hold the cup, the gravity is still there, right? So if God hold the cup, the gravity is still there. So there's no violation of laws of nature. So rather, if God hold the cup, the cup, the reason why the cup doesn't fall is because it is caused by something outside of nature, right? It's a supernatural cause causing it not to drop. And so a miracle, right, is an event that is caused by something outside of nature, but it is not a violation of the laws of nature because the law is still there, right? So yeah, so unless we assume that there are no causes other than natural causes, otherwise miracles are possible, right? But if you assume that there are no causes other than natural causes, then you are actually assuming that there's no God, and therefore there's no miracle, and therefore there's no God, and therefore there's no miracle. I mean, it will be a circular argument, right? You'll be begging the question, right? You'll be like assuming that there's no God, therefore there's no miracle, therefore there's no God. I mean, it will be circular. And so it's a fallacy, right? It's a begging the question. And so it is a very bad objection, right? Now, the second point I want to raise is that we also need to ask, why are there natural laws? Now, as the Kalam cosmological argument has shown, right, and I explained the argument earlier on, the laws of nature must have come from a first cause, which is a creator. So if, and this first cause, I explained earlier on, right, is a creator God. And so if God, since God can create the natural laws, why can't he resurrect the dead? I mean, that would be too easy for him to do, right? So the creator of the universe, certainly he would have, since God can create the entire universe, he will have no problem, right, just resurrecting one person from the dead. I mean, that would be too easy for him to do. And so therefore we can know that miracles must be possible, right? God definitely can do it. A person is really a scientific person, then he should be open-minded and to consider the historical evidence. And I already explained earlier on, right, that there is historical evidence to show that Jesus truly resurrected from the dead. Now there is, so we can summarize it this way, right? Science only describes the natural world when it is left on its own, right? However, a miracle is supposed to describe what happens when the natural world is not left on its own, right? There is something intervening. And therefore, there is actually no contradiction between miracle and science, right? Because science only describes the natural world when it's left on its own. But the miracle is supposed to describe something that happens when the natural world is not left on its own, right? So there is no contradiction between science and miracle because they are describing different things. Now, sometimes people object, they will say, but we have never observed a person resurrected from the dead, right? So sometimes people raise this objection. So even if miracles are possible, but I have never seen someone resurrected from the dead before, right? And so they don't believe. However, neither have we nor any scientist ever observed the Big Bang, right? Have you ever seen the Big Bang, Idril? Have you ever seen the Big Bang happen in front of you, right? Lizu, have you ever seen the Big Bang? Right? No, right? So
really not.
Not, yeah, that's right. Neither have I, right? So neither have Stephen Hawking, right? So Stephen Hawking has never seen the Big Bang happen before him, right? In front of him. Stephen Hawking has never seen the Big Bang happen before. But Stephen Hawking believed that the Big Bang did happen in the past, right? That was how the universe came about, according to Stephen Hawking. So most scientists believe that it happened in the past. Why? Because of the evidence, right? So it will be unscientific to exclude, on the basis of our limited present experience, the possibility that an event which we didn't observe now did happen in the past, right? So we need to be open-minded to consider evidence. And I already explained earlier on that we have good historical evidence to show that Jesus did resurrected in the past, right? That this event happened in the past. And therefore, we should believe that Jesus resurrected as a historical fact, just as we believe the Big Bang, right? Because of the evidence, that's why we should also believe that Jesus resurrected because of the evidence, because there's good historical evidence to show that Jesus did resurrected 2,000 years ago.
And sometimes now you have showed us that even scientists can take a leap of faith, can make a jump in the darkness.
Yes, they can take a leap of faith, but this leap of faith is not unreasonable, right? But rather is based on evidence, right? Because they have evidence to show that the Big Bang did happen in the past, right? Because the cosmic microwave background radiation and also the rate shift which they observe in the galaxies, right? And so based on this evidence, they conclude that the universe was expanding, and they can extrapolate and infer that the universe did have an explosive beginning. So that is why they believe that that's why they believe that the universe actually came from a Big Bang, right? That this event did happen in the past. And likewise, as historians can also infer that Jesus resurrected based on the evidence, based on the evidence that the Christianity existed, right? Christianity began to exist. The earliest and the reason why Christianity began to exist was because there were multiple groups of people who claimed to have seen Jesus alive after he was crucified. That was how Christianity could have started. And so what explained their claim, as I explained earlier on, it must have been caused by a real Jesus who was dead and who was seen alive later, and that was what caused the earliest Christians to believe that he resurrected and claim that he resurrected, and that was what started the Christian church. So just as when we look at the universe, we ask the question, what started the universe? We can look at this evidence which shows that the Big Bang started the universe, and the Big Bang must have come from a first cause, which is God, right? As I explained earlier on. Likewise, when we look at the historical evidence, we can conclude that the Christianity must have started from the resurrection of Jesus. The resurrection of Jesus was the historical event that started Christianity.
So sometimes they may accept that the resurrection of Jesus as a fact, a historical fact, but sometimes they also object that it was not a bodily resurrection, it was a spiritual resurrection. How can you respond to that objection?
All right. So yes, this is another common objection, but again, it has been refuted by scholars. So there is an article published by Cambridge University Press in 2014, and in this article, it explained that the word igero, right, which is translated as raised. Now, this word, we read it in 1 Corinthians 15, verse 3 to 4. Right. So in this passage, it says that, "For I delivered to you as of first importance what I also received, that Christ died for our sins in accordance with the scriptures. He was buried, and that he was raised, egero," that's the Greek word, egero, "on the third day according to the scriptures." Now, this text is taken from 1 Corinthians 15, and it was written in the first century. It reflects the beliefs of the earliest Christians. And we see that the earliest Christians actually proclaimed that Jesus was raised, right, egero. And this word egero, when it's used with reference to the physically dead, which is as in Jesus' case, right, because it says that Jesus died for our sins in verse 3, right? He died physically. And so when it's used with reference to somebody who is dead physically, it always refers to the revivification of the corpse, right? Which is that it was the dead body which was raised again. So this means that it was a bodily resurrection, right? It's not a spiritual resurrection. When the earliest Christians, they were claiming that the physical body of Jesus died, and that this physical body was raised, was alive, revived again, and that it was seen by many people. So this implies that it was referring to a physical resurrection. So that's the first point. Now, the second point is that when we read the context of this passage, right, Paul was referring to the appearance of Jesus to 500 people at once, he says, in verse 6, right? He appeared to more than 500 over people at once. And by emphasizing at once, Paul is emphasizing that it was an objective appearance to a group of people. Now, if what Paul was trying to say was a spiritual resurrection, then there's no need to emphasize that a group of people seeing him at once, right? Because a spiritual resurrection is spiritual, is just something inside their spirit, inside he doesn't have to emphasize that it was appearing to a group of people at once. So by emphasizing that it was appearing to a group of people at once, he's actually emphasizing that it was an objective physical event that was actually seen by a group of people, and that's why they can confirm that it was a bodily resurrection rather than just a spiritual resurrection.
I really admire your way of make apologetics. And I want to say that I was very excited because of your success in the debates with Muslims, atheists. You're the man, for the glory of God. What advice would you give new apologist or someone who went to be a Christian philosopher like you?
Well, the first advice I would give is that we need to take care of our spiritual life, right? So as an apologist, sometimes we may be very concerned about winning a debate or about, right? And sometimes we may be very concerned about our reputation, our fame, and these things can become an idol, right? Can become an idol. It can become so important in a person's life that it can become an idol in his life. So the first advice I would give to an apologist is that we have to be careful about this, right? We should not have these idols, right, in our heart. But rather, we should always think about the glory of God, right? To think about glorifying God, right? So, and also enjoying God, right? Enjoy His presence, enjoy being with Him, delighting yourself in the Lord, and He will give you the desires of your heart, right? So that is in Psalm 35, verse 4. And so, delighting ourselves in the Lord, right? This will help us overcome the temptation of idolatry. And also, knowing the Bible well and believing the promises in the Bible, right? That is also very important for an apologist, because the Bible has wonderful promises, such as ask and you will receive, right? So if we lack wisdom, we can ask from the Lord, and the Lord will give it to us, right? This is in James chapter 1. And so God will give us the wisdom, God will give us the understanding, and He will help us, right, to become a good apologist. Now, the second important advice I would give is that we need to have good understanding of philosophy, of philosophical reasoning, philosophical argumentation. And a very good book which I would recommend is the book written by J.P. Moreland and William Lane Craig called Philosophical Foundations for a Christian Worldview. So this book will explain a lot of important fundamental concepts concerning metaphysics, epistemology, logic, critical thinking. And this will help us in our thinking and equip us to have the good critical thinking skills, right, to become a good apologist. So learning how to ask good questions, how to formulate answers to questions in argument form, right, is also a very important skill. So for example, if you read my books and if you listen to my presentation just now, you will see that I formulate my argument, right, in terms of a syllogism, right? I use a deductive way of formulating. So to show how the premise led to a conclusion, right? To show, this is a very important skill, right? To be able to formulate argument properly. This is something that you will have to learn as an apologist, right? Because it will help you to present your argument in a very rigorous way to show how the premise lead to the conclusion, right? How the conclusion follow from the premise. And another advice I would give is that you can read my books, right? So if you want to be learn to do good apologetics, you can study my books. My books on the Kalam argument, on the resurrection. Now these are all available to be downloaded online, right? So you can go to my website, you can download it from there for free, right? So you can study them, and you'll be equipped to answer a lot of objections, because my books actually answer a lot of objections, right, to Christianity. So you can find a lot of answers to objections in my book. So reading my book will be a good way, right, to study apologetics. And finally, right, always be humble, always be willing to learn, always be willing to be corrected. And so these are all very important attitude, right, to be a good apologist. So always seek to learn and to improve yourself, right? So these will be the advice that I will give, right, to budding apologists.
Thank you for your good advice about the book of William Lane Craig and J.P. Moreland. We have this book in Portuguese. The name is Filosofia e Cosmovisão Cristã. And I believe in the name of Jesus that I will have a good book of you in Portuguese too.
I hope so. Yes, I hope it will be translated in Portuguese as well. Yes.
Thank you for your willingness, and God bless you. My prayers are to you. I'm very thankful for your generosity with me and with the Brazilian public.
Yeah, thank you so much, Israel, and may God bless all of you in Brazil as well.